The West in the 21st century is sick, and we know the cause. Parasites infest the public sector, they own the banks, they run the law firms, they are our ruling oligarchy. Almost every politician in the West is a parasite. There are a few notable exceptions. Some enter politics and instead of increasing their wealth, they do actually lose it. They are there for seemingly honourable reasons, but this is rare. The vast majority of the people elected to represent us do nothing of the sort. They instead steal our money, hand over our land, and allow foreigners to displace our people. All so they can say, "Look at the GDP!" and "Isn't the food great?" Meanwhile, foreign gangs terrorise our people. Traffic is a nightmare. Our cities become less Western by the day, and if you don't like it, well, you're just a Ray White Supreme pizza. One of the worst parasites of all is Daniel Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, who shows us exactly why the parasitic oligarchs flood us with foreigners. After all, if it wasn't for this blatant violation of Australians' property rights, he likely never would have been elected. He has a division set up to push the communist LGBTP agenda, yet when a police officer makes a hand gesture or posts some anti-establishment memes in Dickie's Victoria, that's somehow a crime against common decency. Meanwhile, he tells us to keep on enjoying the multiculturalism that is destroying our country and keeping him in office in the process. Now, as if to confirm his true loyalties lie not with the Australian people, he's selling Australia out to arguably the biggest threat to world peace we've seen in decades. At the same time, he's dedicated the entire state of Victoria to increase power prices at a time when prices are already unbearable for many Aussie families. Thank you so much for watching so far. I promise the content will resume in a moment. This work relies on the generosity of loyal fans to support it, and the best way you can do that, other than sharing the video, is by heading over to RRTV and making a pledge. Not only does this support my work, but it supports a number of independent creators. The added bonus being you get access to a small but growing pool of exclusive RRTV content with any pledge. Thank you so much for your support. Now, back to the important stuff. Arrgh. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is supposedly an innocent project of the Chinese government to facilitate trade and infrastructure around the world. It's about boosting productivity and helping us out, at least according to them. But is this actually true? Are the Chinese really just trying to help us out? Are they really just benevolent builders here to make things better for us all? The answer to that question is a resounding and obvious no. This has as much to do with Chinese benevolence as it does with selling bridges in the desert. The Belt and Road Initiative is little more than Chinese imperialism by trade and debt. Boomer magazine The Spectator USA explains, quote, China's Belt and Road Initiative is touted by Beijing as an attempt at multinational economic cooperation and development, comprising everything from foreign direct investment to the development of infrastructure. However, the purpose of the BRI is not economic or cultural but strategic, and is an effort to mask the expansion of Chinese power. In its strategic intent, the BRI should be considered an imperial project alongside the likes of the British East India Company or the Dutch East Indian Company. With the BRI, China is exercising the imperial excuse just as the EIC did centuries ago. The imperial excuse is the imperial expansion under the guise of economic or cultural development, an alloyed good that is proof of altruistic intent. The imperial excuse legitimizes the imperial power's insertion of influence into the other states, while at the same time attempts to divert suspicions of neo-imperialist control by advocating a legitimate principle. This is done in order to justify control to the local population and international community. The BRI is the most expansive undertaking, physically, economically, and politically, of any single state in history. rather than solely an economic venture, the BRI is a calculated strategic move intended to lay the foundation for Chinese dominance. Chinese President Xi Jinping has stated his intention for China to become the dominant state in international politics by the centenary of the Chinese Communist Revolution in 2049. End quote. This isn't mere speculation either. It's borne out in the experience of countries who sign up for this imperialist policy. Independent journalism website fairplanet.org reports, quote, according to the Centre for Global Development, by the beginning of this year, 8 countries that had signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative were at risk of defaulting on loan repayments. In cases of inability to service these loans, debt diplomacy is applied, with China either forgiving the loan in exchange for silence on key issues like human rights violations and political influence, or China acquiring strategic equities in those countries, as was the case in Sri Lanka. When China was building Sri Lanka's airport in 2007, it offered the country a $360 million credit facility to boost operations and a further $1.9 billion to assist in upgrades and construction of the airport. This was done despite heavy concerns over the commercial viability of the port. Come 2017, Sri Lanka owed Chinese firms over $8 billion from the construction of the airport, which hadn't generated any significant profits for a decade. Sri Lanka was trapped and had to grant the Chinese an 85% share of the port in Hambantota in a 99-year lease agreement. In Djibouti, where the public debt currently stands at 80% of the country's GDP, with a big share of that owed to China, the latter has set up its first overseas military base in the country, as it advances its interests in the continent. End quote. China agreed to build an airport, China loaned the money to Sri Lanka couldn't pay, so China took ownership of the airport and now own a vital piece of infrastructure and land in another country. Who does that sound like? This is what imperialism looks like and should make all reasonable people concerned when they hear the news that Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews just signed us up to the same project. From the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, Victoria has signed a fresh deal with the Chinese government and its global Belt and Road infrastructure project, with Premier Daniel Andrews urging other Australian governments to follow suit. The agreement, signed in Beijing on Wednesday evening, will deepen cooperation between the state and the communist-ruled country in the key areas of infrastructure, innovation, ageing and trade development. Wednesday's deal was signed only a few hours after Federal Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton questioned whether the Premier's trade efforts in China were in the national interest. End quote. Peter Dutton is entirely right to question how this is in our national interests, but don't expect a straight answer from To Here's Dan, a pathological liar and a crook. The truth is, it's not at all in the interests of our nation. In truth, it's directly against our interests. Thus, yet another clear case of dickhead corruption and treason. It doesn't matter how many make-work jobs it creates, this is a clear cost imposed on the Australian common property. The federal government should strike it down if they have any sense of loyalty to Australians at all, but it is doubtful that this will ever happen. In a time when Chinese nationals are flooding our land at the invite of the federal government, one of the highest ranking politicians is crowing about how great it is to sign us over to Chinese Communist Party imperialism. There is no better description for this than treason. But while Daniel Andrews is selling us out to the Chi-Coms, he's also gloating about pushing Australians into poverty. He's recently announced with pride that his government mandated for half our energy to come from expensive and essentially useless windmills and mirrors. Since winning office, largely thanks to unconstitutional mass migration, lies and the apathy of the Australian people, he's pushed the global warming cult's agenda at every opportunity. The first victim of Andrews' incompetence, other than Australians still living in Victoria, was the Hazelwood power plant. One of our only power generators capable of supplying baseload energy requirements. Power prices immediately surged. This came as no surprise to anyone who understands basic economics of supply and demand. When demand increases, as it has substantially due to mass migration, and you cut one of the biggest sources of supply, prices are going to rise. This is not rocket science by any means. Worse, the risk of power outages grew substantially because in times of peak demand, the grid appeared unlikely to cope. These fears were realised in early 2019 when the state saw rolling blackouts as power generation was unable to keep up with said demand. Completely undeterred by reality, proving his cult's ideology wrong, Andrews pressed ahead with his desire to destroy power generation in the state, not to mention push prices up even further. He promised to push as many Victorians into power poverty as possible, and he was going to keep that promise come hell or high water. Now, again, Victorians are at risk of power outages due to a lack of supply in times of peak demand. From the ABC, quote, "More than 1 million Victorian households are at risk of being without power this summer during extreme heat if coal and gas plants are not returned to service in time for peak periods," the energy market operator has warned. The forecast also predicts up to 770,000 New South Wales homes will face a blackout risk on a day of extreme heat once the Liddell power plant has closed in 2023-24 if contingencies are not made. The Victorian worst case scenario is in the Australian Energy Market Operator Forecast of Supply released Thursday that will reignite the political debate over power generation. The report warns that power reliability will continue to decrease in the next decade due to an uncontrollable but increasingly likely high impact event in Australia's ageing coal fleet. End quote. Daniel Andrews' answer to this crisis isn't to do the wise thing and build new baseload capable power generation, it's to build a record number of windmills. Worse still, if that was even possible, it is now increasingly likely that another one of Victoria's coal plants will close early, all thanks to Dick Ears Dan. From Melbourne's Herald Sun, quote, "There are growing fears within the Latrobe Valley community, unions and industry that the Lorne power station may shut well before its stated closure in 2032, placing increased pressure on the energy grid, prices and leaving more than 500 people at the plant unemployed. It is warned a further 500 jobs could go from small businesses across the surrounding region." The Herald Sun understands Energy Australia briefed workers earlier this month and conceded growing policy uncertainty, particularly the Victorian government's 50% renewable target, could lead to it being closed ahead of schedule. End quote. Nor are Victoria and New South Wales alone in this disastrous policy of sacrificing efficient power generation to the cult of the climate. In 2016, South Australia had a statewide blackout as a direct result of pushing windmills and mirrors as the saviour of the world. This is truly insane. There is a mountain of undeniable evidence that so-called renewable energy generation pushes up power prices and causes blackouts. Not to mention, there is no evidence at all that human CO2 emissions are doing any noticeable damage to the climate or that we could do anything about it even if we were. Short of literal genocide, of course, which is actually the ultimate and stated goal of these psychopaths. The apparent short-term solution to skyrocketing prices and blackouts is to do more of what caused the blackouts and price increases in the first place. Despite the facts, Daniel Andrews will press on with his goal of destroying Victoria and pushing us into poverty, all while he sells us out to the Chinese, of course. This is democracy's point of failure on display for all to see. When you allow parasites to vote, all you get are parasites in power. When you let politicians lie, cheat and steal, the only result possible is that liars, cheaters and thieves will take over. Worse still, democracy gives these parasites legitimacy since they can claim that we all voted for it, even though for the most part those who pay for it didn't. Under Daniel Andrews, not even the police are trustworthy. They have a literal division pushing the LGBTP sodomite agenda, but go into a tailspin when one officer makes a hand gesture and shares some memes on his Facebook page. This is using the police as a political enforcement arm. It goes well beyond their mandate and is an insult to their commission and the people of Victoria. Dick Ears Dan even gave himself a pay rise. From the Unshackled, quote, 2017 was a difficult year for many Victorians, with living costs and an ever-worsening crime wave putting the living standards of many residents under serious threat. However, even as the state's taxpayers continue to endure the burden which has been placed upon them by the incompetence of the Andrews government, the state's politicians have decided to add insult to injury. Figures have recently emerged revealing that Victoria's politicians gave themselves a pay rise of 5.3% in 2017. In what was a bipartisan decision, both the Labor and Liberal parties supported the pay rise, which now sees Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews taking home an estimated annual salary of $377,624. End quote. He repeated this act of piracy against taxpayers again this year in 2019, making himself the highest paid state leader in the country. Such is the state of Daniel Andrews' Victoria. They say treason never prospers, yet here not only does it pay, but it pays big time. Historian and Lord Alexander Fraser Tytler predicted all this centuries ago. Democracy works until half the population realise they can vote themselves to productivity of the other half. All they need is a parasite corrupt and dishonest enough to oblige, and we are in no short supply of those. All said, Daniel Andrews is hardly the cause of our problems. He is just a clear face of the parasitism engulfing the entire West as we speak. He's merely a particularly obvious symptom of the lying, cheating and stealing that now pervades our once great civilization. It's at the point where honest, hard-working people can only get ahead if they are willing to engage in the same parasitism to some extent. This cannot last, and nor will it. Eventually, it will all come crashing down because mathematically that which cannot continue will not continue. Along with the obvious lies and blatant theft of our productivity, usury crushes the people under a mountain of debt. This is parasitism on a grand scale. It makes a tiny group of international bankers extremely wealthy, a few hangers-on get rich, and everyone else suffers. Eventually, the whole system will collapse in on itself because that's the only possible outcome. Daniel Andrews didn't cause this, but he is certainly profiting from it. When people like him end up in positions of power, it means something is wrong with the system itself. Even if we manage to vote him out of office, we will only get another just like him, probably worse, down the track. The only solution is enforced truth and reciprocity in rule of law. If it was illegal for Dickie as Dan to lie to us, to cheat to win, and steal our money, he'd never stand a chance. Hell, he'd probably be bankrupt or in prison. All transactions should be fully informed, warranted, consensual, productive, and free from negative externality, and no public statement should ever be a deliberate and obvious lie. This doesn't mean you can't be wrong or have a bad opinion. It only means you can't make assertions of truth that are blatantly and obviously false. Such statements should be grounds for a class action lawsuit where damages are set at a reasonable level, enough to punish the liar severely and prevent further transgressions. We have the tools to do this right now. It's called proprietarianism, and it's even got a nearly complete constitution. Implementing this will enforce reciprocity, this will stop systematic lying, cheating, and stealing, otherwise known as parasitism. We implement this into rule of law, and not only will we save our civilization and our people, but our descendants won't ever have to fight this battle ever again with a little bit of diligence. We will lay the groundwork for the greatest civilization in history. Think what the Industrial Revolution did for economic productivity. This will have the same in terms of political system and social sciences. All we need is the power and the will to implement it, and parasites like Dickie as Dan Andrews will never trouble us again. I hope you enjoyed the video, share the truth around, and I'll see ya when I see ya.